graph. So here we had the traditional representation of the technological improvement by putting into this plot the effort that we defined as the overall amount of financial and knowledge resources and the technology performance. So just to have a quick recap on this. And then we also had the limit of the technology. This means the intrinsic limit of each technology, depending on, of course, its maximum level that can be reached in terms of performance or in terms of improvements, okay? So what is interesting to note about this is that some theories and laws also, as we will see in the next slides, have developed according to yes, so what is the question?
Professor, I want to ask you, is this the first slide of today's lecture?
This is, yes, the first slide of today's lecture. That was also the number, I don't remember, 15 maybe,
Okay, all right.
yesterday, okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. So what do you mean by this question? The e-payment apps indicates the S-curve. So in which terms? I post the slides within a shared Drive, Google Drive folder. You can find the link on my personal page on Corsi di Laurea. Yes, they are not used so much, but we will see this process that is related to innovation adoption in the next slides. Okay, so this phenomenon can be also used to represent how the market adopts a specific innovation. So just to stay on this, so on the improvement of the technology, so how technology evolves within a market or within an industry, we have that starting from the x-axis that represents the effort, a specific law has been developed by Moore, that was an engineering and also one of the co-founders of Intel. This law, actually there are two laws, but they can be defined as one law. So this engineer just noted that within the development of the new processors by Intel, the number of transistors almost doubled each year. This means that the more the technology was improved, right, in terms of developing processors, the number of transistors within each processor doubled. This means that the growth of the technology could be represented according to this, that is also the traditional representation of a power law. Okay? So each technology can be shaped according to a power law. In this case, we have an equation like x power 2, because we have the number of transistors that doubled for each processor each year. So here you can see that we have time here, and the transistor density means the number of transistors within each processors. If we plot these, so the technology improvement that in this case are represented by the density of the transistor with with the expenses in R&D, okay? So here we plot the improvement and time. In the second graph, we plot the improvement in technology and the expenses, so the effort, okay, in R&D. We can see that, of course, also here we have a representation that is growing. So the more the technology improves, in a sense, the more the density improves, the more also the expense in R&D improves. This means that technology improvements, of course, imply a big effort in terms of R&D expenses. And this is also why in the traditional, let me say, representation, here we have that our curves flattens. And we also have here that the cost of marginal improvements increases. This means that, okay, is it clear? If we have here that the expenses grow, each marginal improvement in technology has a higher impact, okay, on the R&D expenses. And this is why this curve flattens, okay? What is interesting in this law and what are the main implications that we can see in this law? Is that from one side, we have the improvement in technologies that in the last decades have, for example, shifted the technology industry from having this variety of different products, just all within this smartphone. This phenomenon is also called the technological convergence. That is the phenomenon according to which the three main devices, that is the personal computer, the television, and the telephone, just converge within one single technological product that is the smartphone.
How's it called? Sorry.
What?
How's it called?
How it's called? Technological convergence. So three devices just converge within one. And according to this growth that we defined as exponential with the Moore law, we have that some implications can lead in the very, very near future to the so-called human brain computer. This means a computer that will be able to process all the information that all the humans in the world are able to process. So, of course, the improvement in technology is not something that proceeds linearly, but again, with the power law. And this is what can be expected in the very near future. The shifting from a normal, let me say, situation, that is the one that we are facing, to a situation in which the relationship between technology and humans will be changed, is also called the point of technological singularity. So the singularity, I don't know if you have ever heard this term. Yes, okay. So there is also a university in the United States that is called the Singularity University, that is one of the leading research centers in the world about, for example, artificial intelligence, big data, and technology. Also, with regard to the implications in terms, for example, of healthcare or health in general. The singularity is the singular point is the point in which we will have this change in the relationship between technology and humans, and having a sort of substitution between what technology is able to process and what a human brain is able to process. So it's not the topic of this course, but for example, the difference between artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how these two different processes, how these two different technologies work, is something that is related to this exponential growth of technology, okay? So, sorry, I can't read your name. So why the previous curve flattens? This is the question. This one. Okay. Okay, so this curve flattens because it represents how the performance of technology, that means the improvements in a specific technology, behaves with relation to the efforts. That means with the expenses in terms of R&D and knowledge, etc. As long as the technology reaches its intrinsic limit, so this means it can be no more developed. It can be also defined as a mature technology. Each marginal improvement in the technology comes to higher costs. So this means that this growth is no more sharpened, as we can see here, for example, but it just flattens because each marginal effort, each marginal improvement in terms of, each marginal effort in terms of resources and R&D just produces lower effects, okay, on the overall improvement. Is it clear? So is it clear? Okay. Yes, tech singularity is the point where technology will be over human intelligence. Yes, this is one. So as you can see from this image, we have one insect brain. This is the first level of the corresponding growth in terms of power, of course, in terms of a power function. Then we have one mouse brain, one human brain, and of course we are just here. And then we have all the human brains. So we will have the computational properties and also the learning properties that belong, for example, to the machine learning. So to the ability of technology to learn from itself, like humans do, will be so high. So here it is estimated at approximately 10 power 25. That technology will be again able to process like all the human brains in the world, okay? This is why it's called singular, because it is of course a process that is quite important and singular again, okay? So another example of the Moore law, so this means the more the technology evolves according to a power law, the more we can see the effects is that, for example, we shifted from a memory case, because we cannot define this as a stick, that was able to store 5 megabytes, and that has, and that has a weight of 1,000 kilos in the 1965, to what is today, so a stick that is able to have a memory of 1 terabyte and more, okay? So this is how technology just evolves, and how, in the example of Intel, the density of the technology evolves according to a power law, okay? Okay? So what happens in the reality, because we said that the S-curve is just an ideal representation, a generic representation of how technology improves. We already saw this picture yesterday, because we have to say that as all the ideal and theoretical representation of the phenomenon, of course, this representation is not always true, because not always technologies reach their limits. So we can also have something that is called discontinuity or discontinuous technology. This means new technology that enters a market before the previous technology has reached its limits, okay? So it is what we define radical technology or radical innovation, sorry, or disruptive innovation. If something new enters a new market before, again, the previous technology has reached its intrinsic limit, we have the so-called discontinuous technology or technological discontinuity. It's exactly the same thing.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Is it true to say that the life of products have become shorter in the last years, or we are like we want to have a new product, so we change it very fast? Or is the life really shorter, or we say that it's not true?
I think definitely like Apple also says it. And they do like upgrades of iOS. I don't know, that's not compatible to their iPhones. So they like oblige you to buy the new generation of iPhones.
But like also it's different. Also the repairings in the products, like all the Mac now cannot be repaired like in the past. So sometimes the firm decide to change it because maybe it also lower cost for ones. I don't know.
So what do you think? Is it true that the life cycle of the products has shortened in the last years? Or maybe this phenomenon is also favored and imposed sometimes by the tech companies? Or maybe both? You think both?
Let's consider that every year we have a new iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, in the last 5 years or 10 years, we have the first iPhone, and after 2 years, the second. And
Yeah.
every year we have another new iPhone. There's also Samsung. It's like battle.
Yeah,
Or-
yeah. It's called the battle. Yes.
But I wouldn't say the life cycle. I think we have a lot of technology that we're able to do device that has like long-term duration. But we
Sorry,
don't do
can you repeat? Thank you.
we don't do a technology, a device that has a long-term expiration because we want to increase capitalism. We want to buy. So I think we are capable of producing a long life cycle, but we just don't do it.
So it's more like a behavioral
Yes, I think the companies do that.
consequence of being capitalists.
Sometimes, like if you break your iPhone screen, you have to pay like the half of the price that you pay to buy it. So you choose to
Yes.
buy a new
It
one.
just
So
happened
also
to me,
the
so.
cost of the repairings, I think that is too high nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. We just
I
want to
think maybe the firms are not they're not spending for input for lowering the cost of repairings. They doesn't care about it.
Yes, please.
Same class question, isn't it? Like 2 years ago, Sarah was like populating like 6 collections a year, but now it's like 24 to 36 collections.
It's Zara, sorry.
Yeah.
Zara, okay.
Class question. Like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They just like produce more because people buy it more, and then we don't use the old things again. So it's just like, as she said, it's just producing this because the consumer wants to.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if you produce more, there will be innovation because it's like hard for the environment, isn't it? So we have more innovations to recycle. So maybe it's sure it's bad for the environment, but maybe it triggers like more innovation to get like rid of pollution.
Okay.
But I would just add that that's also tricky because like Apple now, they say, okay, give me your old iPhone and you can pay less than the new one, for like 200 euros. They're old iPhones, it's not worth 200 euros, those iPhones. So it's better to give it to someone else and just to exchange. So they say they do it for the environment, but I don't believe it, you know? That's why it's different.
Okay, so let's see if your colleagues, both of them, technology advances faster and firms create products that have a useful life shorter than years ago. So actually we have many issues here, okay? So from one side, and this, I start from this because according to me and to my research, the most urgent issue, that is sustainability or greenwashing, as in the example. So it's pretending to be sustainable and to do something for the environment and society and not doing it at all. And this is something that to me can be useful to just make a summary of this. So we have two processes because innovation and markets and the economy in general is a social process. So we have from one side, top-down decisions. This means firms that innovate, firms that in a voluntary way shorten their product life cycles. So this is also a strategy, and I will come back to this point later. And then we have an overall phenomenon that is technological innovation that, as we said yesterday, can start from one industry and be used by another industry. So we have this top-down process. Then we have a bottom-up process that is, coming back to sustainability again, people that organize to consume, to buy, to shop in a more sustainable way, and sometimes force companies to be sustainable. And I'm here, for example, making reference to all the apps or all the services that allow to buy second-hand products, including technology products. And this is something that obliges, again, companies to be more sustainable, even though this has nothing to do with their strategy. So we have these two processes, and the same happens with technology and with the life cycle products. In the first lesson, if I don't remember wrong, if I'm not wrong, I introduced you the concept of cannibalization, right? This is exactly what Apple does with its products. So we have from one side that technology naturally evolves. And so we may have some innovations, again, in an industry that are used in mobile phone industry, for example, or in mobile phone products. And this is something that cannot be stopped in an easy way. But from the other side, we have companies that force consumers, and I totally agree with this because it's a strategy. So it is something that is quite clearly declared by the companies. They force consumer to adopt an innovation, to shift, and we will see, from a little percentage of the overall mass market to the other side. That means to the mass market. And this is like in the Apple example, introducing new products and closing the platform. This is the strategy that is related also to the platform. This means that if I have today an iPhone 3, okay, my iPhone is still in the, 2004 maybe, it stopped there with no possibility to do uploads or updates on the software. This phenomenon, again, is called cannibalization, and it can be done by a company with its own products. This means each year I put on the market iPhone 12, 13, 13S, 13Z, 13 whatever, okay? And all the previous products become suddenly old. And in this case, I force the market to adopt an innovation. And this is also what happened when Apple, again, that is the leader in this tech industry, in this market of the technology sector, introduced, and this is also an example that I did here, the Bluetooth headphones. And also the thing that it did, were introduced the new charger for the iPhones, okay? This means that sometimes companies have a so high power on the market that they can force consumers to adopt an innovation. And also they can force the market to make that innovation become the so-called standard. This means that each company that wants to compete within that specific industry has to adopt a specific standard. And that is where companies do the battles, okay? So I agree with your positions. It's from one side, of course, a social process. So we live in a capitalist society with all its pros and cons. And one of these cons is that companies can force us to do something that maybe we believe it's the end of a rational process or quite rational process, but it is totally maybe something different, okay?
Is the AirPods a component innovation that is up there?
Well, actually, there we had also a difference in the technology, an innovation on the technology.
Right.
Yes, because we shifted from the wired headphone with the wires to the Bluetooth. And we also had that few months later, Samsung started to produce the wireless headphones. Okay, so it is competing with the standards. But we also have, in this case, just not to make always references to Apple and Samsung, Nespresso was also an innovation. And it was such a huge innovation that traditional companies that produce coffees started to produce compatible capsule with Nespresso machines. So this means forcing competitors and the market to go towards one direction that, of course, is decided by companies that have a huge and relevant market power. Okay? Yes, it is a strategy. So again, it is something that is voluntarily done by a company. Okay? So what is a discontinuous technology? Something that breaks the normal shape of the S-curve of a technology. Is something that, of course, is based on an entirely new knowledge base by fulfilling the same needs. So, for example, the need to have an headphone is substituted or is fulfilled by a new technology. What does it mean, an entirely new knowledge base? It means that usually we have an architectural innovation. So we have an innovation in the design, in the knowledge, in the architecture of the overall process or product. So technological discontinuity means that we define a new innovation that gives rise also to new process and product innovation. And the example of the headphones is very useful because we start from introducing a discontinuous technology, so wireless headphones, and we work with, for example, product innovation. So we work on incremental improvements of that product. And it's, for example, the possibility to charge the headphones without the wire, here again. So I take the technology wireless and I apply the same technology to the product itself, that is the headphones, and also to the charger case, okay? So in this case, again, we need an entirely new knowledge base. So we are talking about an architectural innovation. a new design, new knowledge, new architecture, new way in which the components of a product system interact with each other, okay? Of course, the example is from carbon copying to photocopying, from vinyl to compact discs, or from compact discs to the MP3 technology. So we can imagine this discontinuity as jumps in the technology. So the old technology maybe doesn't reach its maturity, so doesn't reach its limit, because we have a discontinuity. So of course, like each innovation, also discontinuous technology usually have lower performances at the beginning. And here we have, for example, the example we made yesterday. So the first attempt to substitute a horse-drawn carriage with a self-drawn carriage. We had here the steam. And as I said yesterday, the performance of this car, let's call it car or carriage, were lower than the ones of an horse. So of course, the process towards a new technology that can be discontinuous is not so easy. So it is made of failures, okay, like all the innovation processes. Also, we may have the so-called reluctancy of the incumbent, so of companies that develop a technology, a previous technology, and maybe are working on incremental innovation about the existing technology. So if I am focusing on an existing technology and maybe working on process or product innovation to improve that specific knowledge and to improve that specific innovation, I may be reluctant to adopt a new technology that of course implies new investments, new research, new knowledge, and starting again on the market with proposing a new technology, okay? So usually, these discontinuous technology are introduced within a market by market leaders that of course have the power in terms of resources and knowledge, or by new companies, okay, that might, for example, diversificate, so enter a new industry by using and exploiting a technology developed in one industry to another industry, okay? And this is what, for example, we already saw with Elon Musk, and by the strategy of integrating all the product phases of building a spaceship differently from the competitors that used to buy some of the components outside. So this can be also a way in which innovation can be introduced within an industry. Yes, it can be a competence destroying innovation, yes, if of course the incumbent has not the competence to develop that specific technology, okay? So we always have to remember the relativeness of the classifications of the innovations, okay? So let's see what happens here when we have this discontinuity. So just to keep this representation, this standard representation, we may have two different representation of how a discontinuous technology can break the pre-existing technology. So we might have the case in which the second technology has a steeper curve, so it just has a better performance in terms of the improvement. So it grows faster. This means that, of course, we also have less effort, okay, in terms of, again, investments in R&D and knowledge and etc. Right? So we have this first case. Or in the other case, we might have that the second technology, so the discontinuous technology, has an higher limit. Okay? So maybe it can be developed starting from a point of the pre-existing technology and just having a higher limit. This means having higher possibilities to be improved. Okay, and in this case, having a better performance, this means having better returns for the company, even though it implies higher effort. Of course, here we are representing the case in which companies are not prepared to this technology, so to this discontinuity in the technological paradigm. But in the long run, that, like we all know, beyond being all dead, the disruptive technology will substitute the pre-existing technology. Nevertheless, what the incumbent companies want. Okay, so if the market accepts the new technology, because we have here the performance, okay, so we have in a sense, the rate of acceptance of the market, the new technology will replace the existing technology. And so all the companies, even if they can be reluctant at the beginning to adopting a new technology, will have to adopt this technology. And this also happens with the standards, so with the competition on what is the standard, the so-called dominant standard within a defined technological paradigm. And here again, the example of the USB-C charger, okay, for the iPhone, maybe in the future. This will be the dominant standard unless the incumbent, unless the companies that already operate within a specific industry are willing to accept or not that technology, okay? Okay, yes? Perfect. So let's see what happens on the other side of the market, because so far we have described what happens in the improvement of the technology, so from the producer side. But we also said that this pattern, this S-curve, can also be used to represent how technology is adopted. So what is the shape of technology diffusion within the markets? Yes, exactly, like also the wireless chargers. So how can we represent technology diffusion? We said that the shape is the same. So at the end, we will have the same shape of the curve. But in this case, we don't have effort and performance. We have the number of adopters and the time. So the S-curve of technology diffusion represents how, simply, adopters within a market accept or adopt a technology through time. Also here we have the S. So we have the adoption that is very, very slow at the beginning. Then we have an acceleration in the rate of adoption within a market. And then we have the so-called saturation of the market. This means that the rate of adoption declines. So we will see it. Yes, we also have to say here about these USB-C links that we will have probably the intervention of the policymakers in regulating the adoption of this innovation. So this is quite a specific case. So this is the tendency, as I already said in this class, of the European Union to ask to producers to just adopt one single standard for all the chargers. And this will be probably the USB-C. Yes, it is also like the product life cycle, exactly the same, quite the same. So again, we have this S shape. The things that we have to say, to precise is that we here are talking about adopting a technology. And this doesn't mean knowing that a technology exists. So this representation is related to the fact that the market effectively adopts, this means buy a new technology, okay? Because of course, we might know that a technology exists, but still don't want to adopt it. Why technology diffusion is generally lower than information diffusion? Because of course we might be aware of a variety of new technology, but we don't accept this, or this doesn't mean that we will accept this technology, because new technology requires new knowledge to be used. And maybe not everyone is willing to acquire this new knowledge, or at least not everyone at the same time. And also because technology may require complementary resources. So innovation also in the complementors, or in the modules, or in the components, or in something that can be again complementary. So this means that completes the offer of a specific innovation. And these two elements can, of course, slow down the process of innovation adoption. So the S-curve is, of course, related to the improvement. So these two curves have the same shape and are, of course, influenced each other. So here I have the degree, here we have the representation of the sales price of electronics, video cassette recorders, DVDs, and cell phones. This is the cell phones. And here we have the adoption rate. This means the penetration in the market by the consumer. So, of course, if we have lower price, we will have a higher rate of penetration in the market. This is something very logical, okay, if we see it from the external. But from the internal, the fact that a company manages to reduce the sale prices means that internally he developed scale economies, scope economies. It acted on, for example, the efficiency of the processes, and this efficiency and overall economies translated into, of course, lowering the prices. So actually, we will see this slide later. Actually, this is the traditional representation of the innovation adoption. We have the time here and the percentage, cumulative percentage of the adopters on the y-axis. As we can see, it has exactly the same shape. So slow increase at the beginning, higher increase here, and natural limits of the market. What happens if we plot the time? So this means the time in which an innovation is adopted on the market with the share, so not with the cumulative percentage of the adopters, but with the share of the overall market that potentially can adopt an innovation. We have this representation that is just a traditional bell-shaped curve, okay? And this is also the representation that made Roger, that was one of the most important researchers on innovation, who designed this that is called the innovation adoption curve. Yes, of course, adoption also is dependent on the purchasing power, but the fact that the company is able to lower the prices means that it has been previously able to develop economies. Okay. And we will see it by analyzing this representation. So what is the important thing in this representation? Rogers just identified these categories, these 5 categories of subjects that behave differently with reference to innovation adoption within a market. We may distinguish within the market between innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. Have you ever seen this representation? Yes? Yes and no. Okay, so for those who studied innovation in general, this is the most famous representation of innovation adoption, okay? So what did Rogers say? He said that when a company introduces on the market an innovation, we will have approximately the 2.5% of the market that is represented by innovators. Innovators are usually, 1 minute, Asia, we will start from the first. So we will start from innovators. They are the first kind of subjects that adopt innovation. They usually are described as curious, as risk-taking, and also as people who have financial availability to sustain, at the beginning, of course, of the introduction of an innovation, higher costs. Let's think, for example, if you have friends or if you know people that just experiment and buy everything that is new. Okay? I believe that each of us knows at least one innovator. They are also opinion leader. So with the fact that they usually buy for first an innovation, they also are believed to be opinion leaders, by the reference community. Then we have the early adopters, who are just like innovators, but they are less risk takers, okay? They have a lower attitude toward risk, okay, with respect to innovators. They are approximately this percentage. So when a company reaches the early adopters, it reaches the 16% of the market. So here again, we have financial availability and disposition toward innovation. And also here we have that the early adopters are recognized as opinion leaders. So their opinion about the new technology is considered valuable by the community. Let's think, for example, to all the YouTubers that just make videos about new technologies, or YouTubers, or on any other social network. So people who try things first and just give opinion, okay? Then we have the early majority and the late majority. In this case, we reach the so-called mass market. So as you can see, here we have, with the shift from the early adopters to the early majority, we have the higher increase in this curve. So this means that here we acquire almost the 34% of the market that is represented by the early majority, and another 35% is represented by the late majority. So in this phase of the curve, we are, if we reach this percentage of the market, we officially entered in the mass market, okay? And then we have the so-called laggards. Laggards are those kind of subjects that don't depend on innovation. They are not interested in innovation. They are skeptical. And they adopt an innovation only when they are forced to adopt an innovation. Let's think, for example, I just will make a very, very funny example to parents who are forced to adopt Skype or FaceTime or WhatsApp to call each other, okay? At least mine. They were forced to adopt the innovation. What? Yeah, no, also before the pandemic, yes. They were forced to shift to the third millennium. So this is actually one of the most famous and used representation for the firms about innovation adoption. So just let me see. Yes, it's the normal distribution, exactly. So it is, yes, exactly the same. So as I was saying, it is just a classic bell-shaped curve. So we have the same here, innovators and laggards, and early and late majority are, again, the mass market, okay? So, of course, this is a tool that has not to be used as a prescriptive tool, and this was the content of the previous slide. So it can be useful to map the markets, but of course, it's not something on which companies rely to define their strategies, okay? Because it also is related to the intrinsic limit of technology. So it starts from the representation of the technology limit. Of course, the shape of the curve can be modified by the market, by innovation in the complementors. complementary technology or component technology. So we might have some shocks in the market that just don't allow to follow the traditional representation. And also because if this tool is used as a prescriptive tool, this means as a tool that will certainly define what will happen in the market, the adoption of this tool could, for example, be misleading for manager when switching from one technology to another. For example, managers could think of, okay, we didn't still reach the limit of the technology, or we didn't still reach, I don't know, for example, the early adopters, okay? In this case, of course, it can be misleading. So it is something only useful to map a market and to understand a specific phenomenon, but not to trace a general rule on how a technology will evolve, both from the improvement side, so from the producer side, and from the market side, so from the adoption. So what is interesting with this? So here you have, I reported also all the description. So 2 and 5%, 13.5%, 34 and 34, and 16%, that is the sum of the previous two. You will have here the description that you will also find in your book. What is interesting is that this bell-shaped curve that represents the innovation adoption can be used together with this representation. That is the traditional representation of the product life cycle, okay? So here we have the Rogers curve about the innovation adoption with the 5 kinds of categories of subjects. And we can make a comparison between the stage at which the product life cycle is and the corresponding kind of adopter in the innovation curve. So you all know what is a product life cycle. We have time and sales here, and adopters and time here for the Rogers curve. We have the stages of the product life cycle, so R&D, introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. And of course, we will have that in the stage of R&D, so where the innovation is at very, very preliminary stage, we will have, of course, the adoption by the innovators, because they are wealthy, they are risk takers, okay? And they have a strong propensity to innovation. In the phase of introduction, so when we have a slow increase in the sales of a new product, we will have the early adopters. In the growth, we will have the early majority, and we say that this is the preliminary phase to the mass market, together with the maturity, in which we have the late majority, that is the consolidation of the mass market. And then as we define the laggards and subjects that are not willing to adopt an innovation unless they are forced to, of course, we will have that this subject will adopt the innovation in the decline. So when, of course, the product life cycle is just declining, it's just declining. Stop. Okay, so I believe that this is interesting. This is something that I believe can be useful to link different frameworks that maybe we analyze separately. in just one phenomenon that is actually the same. So the last two concepts of this chapter are related to how technology can evolve in general. And in particularly, we have here two contributions by some scholars that define the way in which overall the technology change and evolves. So we have that the very same representation of the technology as curves, that is, slow decrease at the beginning, slow increase, sorry, at the beginning, increase and flattens in the curve, can be also represented in a different way, in two different ways we will see here. We have this first representation that is made by Atterbach and Abernathy, two very, very famous scholars in the field of innovation management. They distinguished between these two phases, that is, slow increase, increase, and decrease, two different phases. The first one can be defined as a fluid phase, while the second one can be defined the specific phase. In the first phase, that is the fluid phase, in this phase, we can identify what we call as technological discontinuity. So the fluid phase is when we have uncertainty in the market, discontinuity, so a new technology that is introduced, and the experimentation, so that means the exploration of the firms about different alternatives in a specific innovation. So what are the different possible solutions that can help organizations to overcome this fluid phase? So uncertainty, discontinuity, exploration, experiments, etc. When we have a dominant design, a dominant standard, so when we have something around which a technological innovation can stop, let me say, this exploration and experimentation process, we have the specific phase in which, of course, companies don't focus anymore on exploring or experimenting, but of course they focus on incremental innovation. In this case, we have, so in the fluid phase, we have, again, new technology, new markets, new industries, and usually we have architectural innovation. Once we define the architecture or the design, so once we define an overall and shared design for a specific innovation, we have the specific phase, that means component innovation or incremental innovation. We also might have these different two phases within a specific market, within one market. Here is, for example, the energy market, in which we have the traditional producers, that means fossil fuels companies that operate within a specific phase in which we have a dominant standard and a stable architecture. So they operate following and pursuing an incremental innovation. And we have the fluid phase, so the searching for a dominant standard for example, all the companies that deal with renewable sources, or some of them. So in the same industry, we might have different phases according to the technology. Okay, so companies that operate in the different phases.
Sorry, so
Yes?
dominant designs, they don't change much design, right?
Sorry, dominant design?
It doesn't change much design, it's like stable.
Yes. A dominant design is when a shared design emerges within a specific industry. Dominant doesn't mean the best. It just means the one around which all the companies and also the users find agreement, an architecture that is stable. So this means, for example, when in the 90s we had one of the most famous battles around the design was Blu-ray disc and DVD disc, okay? And the battle was about, which will have been the dominant design for the movies at home. So the battle was between, again, Blu-rays and DVD. The Blu-rays was a better technology, but the dominant design, so the one that at the end became the shared design, even though it's not the best solution, again, was the DVD technology, okay? So is the architecture, the product or system architecture around which companies and markets find consensus. And starting from this, they start doing incremental innovation, okay? This is a dominant design, but we will see it in the future chapters. Yes, Apple is, of course, at the dominant design phase, even though it can shift also to a fluid phase when technological discontinuity emerges, or it can also introduce a new technology. So these big companies that are also leaders, again, can easily shift from one phase to another. So quite the same or similar definition and representation of these cycles of the technology is the one proposed by Anderson and Tushman. Anderson is also the one who theorized the long tail theory. I don't know if you have ever heard. So the same, again, the same process that is the one that distinguishes between 2 points that, of course, are related each other, are the one that they define as the era of ferment in which we have design competition and substitution. That was the fluid phase that we defined previously, and the era of incremental change in which, of course, we have the specific phase. We have 2 different elements that give rise to each of these 2. From one side, we have technological discontinuity that, of course, starts the era of ferment or the fluid phase or the uncertainty phase or the era of competition on the design, on the standards, and substitution of the old standards. And then we have, as the outcome of this half cycle, the selection of one dominant design. And of course, once we have the definition of one dominant design, we can start with incremental innovation. Okay, so it's exactly the same rationale between these 2 models. The first one defines fluid and specific phase, and this one defines between ferment and incremental change. But what matters is technological discontinuity from one side and the definition of the dominant design or dominant standard on the other. Okay? Well, I don't know that Apple is scary to change something. I just believe that they want to be sure to not lose money on innovation like they did in the past. So I don't know if you have ever heard about Apple Newton. No, it was Newton, Apple Newton. It was the very, very first example of an iPad. And he said, we will see it when we will talk about, yes, interfaces. It was something that should have copied the handwriting into text. Okay, it was something like I write with a pen and it translates into a Word or a document. Okay. But it was very, very heavy. He had problems in elaborating information. He had problems in effectively recognizing the handwriting process. And it was the biggest technological failure of Apple. So I believe, again, that Apple just want to be sure that once it introduces, yes, Newton was problematic. So it is also, and we will see specifically in chapter 5, the right timing to introduce an innovation. So again, I just believe that they want to be sure to introduce a successful innovation within a market. Okay. So some important thing about the dominant design or dominant standard that I quietly already anticipated. So we will always have that a dominant design will emerge at the end of the technological discontinuity process. And we will also have that the dominant design is never or quite never the best possible solution. It is always or quite always an average of the best solution or an average of the solution that are perceived as being the best as an average between the producers and the market. So the case of the standard battle between Blu-ray disc and DVD disc is one of the main examples in this case. So the dominant design and the dominant standard is never or quite never the best possible solution. And also, this is also related to the introduction to when we introduce the notion of technological discontinuity, is that, of course, if we define these two different phases in which from one side we have exploration and on the other side we have incremental changes, once firms operate in the era of incremental design or in the era of, in the specific phase, they invest in efficiency, they invest in improving product and processes. And this is why, and partly explains why incumbent firms, so why firms that operate with the existing technology may be reluctant to adopt a new technology or sometimes may also not recognize that the new technology has been created in the market. Okay, do you have questions? Observations? No? You want a coffee? Maybe. Okay, so thank you. See you on Monday.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.